Good morning and welcome to the JCC of San Francisco's conversation today about Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, his legacy, his life, with an extraordinary set of panelists, Ambassador Itamar Rabinovich and Judge Abe Sofer. I want to just say welcome to all of you. Good morning to those in the United States and good evening to all of you joining us from Israel. The JCC of San Francisco pre-pandemic was the third largest JCC in North America. And we pride ourselves on our ability to generate conversations and enthusiasm about Jewish ideas and the role of ideas in general throughout American society and beyond. And we are delighted that in this pandemic moment, there is a little bit of silver lining, which is that we can welcome such a broad cross-section of the community to conversations like these. And I also want to spend a moment to especially thank all of you out there who are supporters of the JCCSF, who are supporters perhaps of your local Jewish communities. Now more than ever, we all need to pull together in support of the institutions and the culture that sustains us. And with that, I will turn the mic over to Robert Wise, the Chief Development Officer for the JCC of San Francisco.
Thank you, Marcy, and thank you everybody for joining us. I just want to take a quick minute here to thank our supporters, in particular the Correct Foundation, the San Francisco Jewish Community Federation and Endowment Fund, the Toby Philanthropies, the Horace Goldsmith Foundation, and also the Lisa and Douglas Goldman Fund. We really appreciate your ongoing support over the years, and in particular in this time of the pandemic. I'd also like to just recognize, this is all about, life is all about relationships, many people say, and it's a real testament to Prime Minister Rabin and also to Itamar Rabinovich, to their relationships over the years, that we have almost 100 people who have signed up for this webinar to discuss Rabin, his life and legacy, and we very much appreciate you, Itamar, for taking the time out, and also you, Judge Sofer. So with that, let me introduce Judge Abe Sofer, who's been the George P. Schultz Senior Fellow in International Law and Diplomacy at Stanford's Hoover Institution since 1994. He served from 1985 to 1990 as State Department legal advisor under Secretaries of State George Shultz and James Baker. During that time, he was principal negotiator of several agreements, including the final border agreement between Israel and Egypt at Taba. Prior to that, he was federal district court judge in New York, a professor of law at Columbia University, and a federal prosecutor. He's written on national security issues, Iran, Israel, the Middle East, and among other subjects. And this is the abbreviated version. So with that, I will bow out and pass it to you, Abe. Thanks very much.
Well, thank you very much, Robert, for putting this event together. And thanks to Marcy for her exceptional leadership. Thank you, Marcy. We're privileged today to have Itamar Rabinovich with us to help understand the character and contributions of Yitzhak Rabin. Rabin was born in Israel. Itamar also was born in Israel and received his bachelor's, master's, and doctorate degrees, respectively, from Hebrew University, Tel Aviv University, and UCLA. He is maybe, I would think, the world's really foremost modern Middle East history expert. I mean, a wonderful scholar and a diplomat who served as Israel's ambassador to the US from 1993 to 1996. He was president of Tel Aviv University from 1999 to 2007, and currently is a distinguished fellow or professor at several institutions, including NYU and the Brookings Institution, as well as being the founder and president of the Israel Institute, which ensures access to universities around the world, of course, to courses about modern Israel. He's published or edited several books, including his 2017 classic, Yitzhak Rabin, Soldier, Leader, Statesman, as well as many articles, speeches, and op-eds. He has been honored by many countries and institutions around the world, His book on Rabin has been translated into 8 languages, and it received the Washington Institute's Gold Medal in 2017. Ambassador Rabinovich knew Rabin well and knows the history of Israel. We could not hope for a more knowledgeable and insightful guide to this complex and heroic prime minister who was murdered by a Jewish Israeli for attempting to make peace between Israel and the Palestinians. Mr. Ambassador Itamar, what was your relationship with Yitzhak Rabin, and why did you decide to write a book about him?
Well, first and foremost, I worked under him and for him. He was my leader, both a leader of my country and a leader of the government and the team of which I was part. But in the course of our work together, we became very close personally. I found him to be a wonderful human being, a wonderful person to work for. And his death was for me, first and foremost, a personal loss. Obviously, it has been a great tragedy for the country and for our people. But for me, first and foremost, a personal loss. Now, the reason for writing the book is quite simple. I was invited by Yale University Press, which publishes a series called Jewish Lives, biographies of great Jews, a few Israelis among them. And when they asked me, I suppose they thought that as someone who was a professional historian and worked for Rabin and knew him well, I was well suited to do it. My immediate thought is, of course, how come I haven't thought about it myself? But anyway, when the idea came up, I said an immediate, no, not really immediate. I called 2 persons before I made the decision. I called Dalia, his daughter, to make sure that it's fine with the family. And I called Eisenhowers, his speechwriter, who himself passed away a few weeks ago, who I knew always wanted to write a book about Rabin. I suspected he was not about to do it, but we were friends and colleagues, and I thought I should ask him first, and he said, no, go ahead, do it. And then I told the Yale Press, of course, I will do it.
Well, it was a very good thing you did. I really enjoyed the book. It starts out with, well, it goes through Rabin's life chronologically. And you start off talking about his service as a soldier in the 1948 war. He had a life that corresponded with modern Israel from the 48 war, where he was a soldier, right to the time he was assassinated, covered the Oslo II Accords. So he really, it's a very important life in Israeli history. Do you think, thinking first about his military experiences, what impact do you think that had on his overall character and policies?
Right. I actually began earlier than 48. I began with childhood, the family, which in terms of my research was perhaps the most interesting part. His mother was a very powerful figure, had a huge impact on his character. And these were the parts of his life I knew less about and learned more as I did the research. And one thing I discovered in doing the research was that he had a natural talent for military affairs. He was a wonderful military planner, not just a planner and an officer a general who could see that things were not only planned, but actually happened. This was identified early on by his commander in the elite units of the Jewish community in pre-state Israel, Yigal Allon, who made him his aide, actually, chief executive assistant, and took him quickly through the ranks, so that by 1948, when Rabin was 26, and the War of Independence broke out, he was a colonel and a brigade commander. I mean, we didn't have divisions. A brigade was the largest unit in the IDF, and a brigade that was sent to maybe the most important front and the most difficult one, namely the road to Jerusalem and the fighting in Jerusalem. That was a very powerful and a very sad part of his life, given the number of casualty and the fierceness of the fighting at the time.
Right.
Yeah. Now, of course, when you serve so many years in the military, you both make your imprint and you're influenced by the military, by the discipline, by the need to plan, by the importance both of the overall picture and the details. When Rabin used to send later on a commando unit on a dangerous mission across the border, he would go with them, with the planners, into the smallest detail. Or famously, when Rabin, as prime minister, had to authorize the expedition to Entebbe to save the hostages taken by the terrorists to Idi Amin in Uganda, he did not approve the plan until he was 100% sure that he was not sending Israel's elite soldiers into a death trap. So both a large picture and very meticulous planning.
He wasn't just what they called a security hawk. He was an expert at security, is what you're saying, and what your book is very clear.
Yeah, expert. Rabin, I would say, in general, was not a charismatic leader. He didn't have the natural charisma of, let's say, Moshe Dayan or Menachem Begin, somebody who galvanized multitudes of people. But he had authority. And that authority derived from several sources. One of them was the recognition that he was an expert on national security, which in Israel, of course, was and is an existential issue. And his leadership, which ultimately led to his second term as prime minister in the 90s, was built as Minister of Defense in the 1980s when he became, to the Israeli public, Mr. National Security.
Now you treat him as, and by then he was chief of staff, as the architect of the 1967 war. And you go into some detail about how difficult it was for him and for Israel to prepare for that war and actually act first after many, of course, many actions that indicated that Israel was going to be attacked itself. Tell us, give us more of that flavor of what you felt about what he went through in not only planning that war, but implementing it.
Okay, so the crisis that, the full-fledged crisis that led to the Six-Day War broke out in May 1967, when Egypt remilitarized the Sinai, sent its army into the Sinai that had been demilitarized since the 1956 war, and obviously challenged Israel in a very severe way. At that point, Rabin had been chief of staff for about 3 years, a very powerful chief of staff. The Minister of Defense, after Ben-Gurion left power, was Levi Eshkol. Himself was more of an economist than a security person, who totally relied on Rabin. So Rabin, in fact, was chief of staff and Minister of Defense. He was also very enjoyed an unusual authority with his own generals, because he reached that position at a relatively older age. He was very senior. So he was king of the hill for 3 years. And then the crisis broke out, which he had not anticipated, and that undermined his position with the cabinet. He then also found himself torn between a very hawkish general staff that felt that the challenge was such that Israel had to go to war and put an end to it, and a cabinet that was quite dovish and hesitated to go to war. And there were counter pressures on Rabin. The prime minister was not somebody he could really consult with. He had to go and talk to Ben Gurion in retirement. That was not an easy conversation. The position of the United States was not very clear. I mean, we know in retrospect that President Johnson actually wanted Israel to go to war, relieve the US of the dilemma that it itself was facing, but it would not say so. You can understand. I mean, Abe, you were very senior in US government. You know that it would be very difficult for a US president to tell the leaders of another country to give them a green light to go to war. So the United States didn't quite do that, and there were very sharp debates in the Israeli government as to what the United States really wanted from Israel. So all these cross pressures between May 15, when the crisis broke out, and the early June, when the war was actually launched, was a very difficult period for Rabin. Let me add to that the fact that given the political crisis that erupted in the country, Moshe Dayan was invited back by Eshkol into the government, was made Minister of Defense. So now the Chief of Staff had a boss, and a very dominant boss, Moshe Dayan. They were not great friends and not fully coordinated, but fortunately for them and us, the war ended with such a huge victory that there was enough credit for both of them to share. So the glory of the victory went both to Moshe Dayan and to Yitzhak Rabin.
Could you add a word about Ezer Weizman's role then? I found that was something I didn't know anything about until I read your wonderful book.
Yeah, let me begin with a more general statement. Israel of the 60s, 50s, 60s was a very small place. We began in independence in 1948 with a Jewish community of 600,000 people. And it was a very small place, very, very tight and dense. And there were lots of very capable leaders. And the competition for position and influence was very stiff. So in the elite of the time, Ben Gurion, Dayan, Peres, Weizmann, Rabin, etc., the relationship tended to be complex. As a Weizmann was a brilliant commander of the Air Force, he and Rabin together prepared the plan that enabled the Israeli Air Force to destroy the Arab air forces in the first hours of the war and actually determine the outcome of the war right on. That they did together. But other than that, they were rivals. When Rabin had sort of a mild breakdown for 2 days, as a Weizmann acted for him, and that introduced an element of tension between them that never went away. Later on, when Weizmann became president, again, the relationship between the prime minister and the president was full of tensions. And one of my issues as ambassador was to deal with both the president and the prime minister. Being the Israeli ambassador in Washington is tough diplomacy, not just vis-a-vis the United States, but also back home.
Well, we'll come back to that subject for sure. You point out, though, that although the 67 war was a great victory for Israel's security, it was a mixed blessing. The government gave the settlement movement a green light at that point, even though Rabin, as you say, was very scornful of the movement. Do you think that others in the government at that time that permitted this settlement movement to begin in earnest shared Rabin's attitude, or that they really were greater Israel proponents?
Well, there are two different issues here. One is that some people thought that one major lesson from the crisis that preceded the war was that Israel could not afford to live in these indefensible borders. And given the magnitude of the victory and the fact that the rules of war or international relations are that normally the aggressors are punished and the victors are rewarded, that Israel should use the outcome of the war, the spectacular victory, in order to improve its territory and borders. That's a security issue. But what we also had was that the fact that Israelis became reunited with the West Bank, the biblical sites, particularly Jerusalem, the wall, that released a huge wave of sentiment, emotion, and ideology. And religious Zionism, which had been a very moderate political force in Israel before 1967, was taken over by a messianic group, which was the parent of the settler movement. And the ideology of the settler was, okay, the secular Zionists established the state of Israel. It is our historic task to also redeem the biblical heartlands, the West Bank, Judea and Samaria, and we will begin this historic mission by settling it. And that some of the cabinet ministers were sympathetic to that, and some, like Rabin, saw a danger in that.
Peres told me that he supported, he regretted it, but he supported the settlement movement after 67 because he thought that building settlements would get the Palestinians to agree to a peace treaty of some sort, and that it didn't work. He was very, very, seemed sincere in telling me that. What do you feel, I mean, about not only Peres's position, but do you think that, certainly Rabin seems to have gone along with it. Did anyone stand up and say, well, this could be a complication for Israel in the future?
Yeah, the answer to the last part of the question is, of course, yes. There were politicians, intellectuals who pointed to the danger. The philosopher, the scientist, Isaiah Leibovich, a very well-known Israeli intellectual, was the most eloquent among them. But let me put the Peres argument in context. You see, one of the most important issues in conflict and conflict resolution has to do with the question, how do the parties to the conflict view the element of time? Is time for me or is time against me? Because if time is for me, let me wait. If time is against me, let me make the deal now. And oftentimes you hear the Palestinian, Arab argument, there are more than 300 million Arabs, there are 8 million Jews, there's nothing wrong with our genes. At some point, we'll catch up with them, and this would be the end of that. And it was in the interest of Israelis who wanted to make a peace settlement to persuade them that time was not on their side. So the argument that Peres mentioned to you said, okay, if we begin to settle the West Bank, this could persuade the Palestinians that time was not on their side. Obviously, he came to realize that this was not a good argument and eventually became very, very dovish.
Yeah, it seems to be, he certainly seems sincere when he talked to me about it. Now, going on from this amazing plan and implementation in the 67 war, Rabin was hoping to be a member of the cabinet, as you describe in your book, but was very disappointed when Golda Meir, who was prime minister, sent him to Washington, D.C. instead, in the position that you ultimately held. Well, how do you view that? You had a lot to say about it in the book, and it was very important.
Yeah. Actually, a minor correction. That the disagreements with Golda came later. Actually, Rabin did want to go to Washington because he did want to go into politics. He did feel that he needed better preparation. He had been a military man, limited horizons. He felt that he didn't know the world, the international scene sufficiently, and that Washington would be the best place to do that. And he was right. He was a great ambassador, and he had a mentor in Washington, Henry Kissinger. And they became great friends, and Kissinger had a huge influence on Rabin's expertise and outlook. Now, Golda initially was very friendly with Rabin. At some point, I couldn't quite find out exactly when and precisely why the relationship soured. She turned against him. He wanted to become a cabinet member. She took her time, and famously, on the last visit she had to Washington when Rabin was still ambassador in early 1973, Nixon was the president, and Nixon said to her, "Oh, Rabin is finishing his term here. He's going back to Israel. He's been a great ambassador. I hope that you will promote him." And Golda said, "It depends on how he will behave." Yeah, Golda was.
Wow.
Yeah, Golda was our Margaret Thatcher. So anyway, ironically, as happens many times in history, because of the October War, she lost her position. She had to resign in 1974. And Rabin represented a fresh face, the great victor of 67, a very successful ambassador in Washington. And the Labour Party chose him to replace Golda as prime minister, 1974. So his expectation to become a cabinet member was fulfilled beyond all hope. Became a few months minister and then prime minister.
And that was an extraordinary development. That the kind of thing, as you said, that happens in history by not being in Israel in '73 and not having any responsibility for the war. There were so many people senior to him, or certainly politically, that were passed over for the job he got because of that. How did he do as prime minister between 74 and 77?
It was a mixed record. In term, I put it briefly as policy success, political failure. I mean, he achieved quite a few things as prime minister. He inherited an Israel that had suffered the casualties and the trauma of the October War. The IDF was depleted, the economy was in shambles, and he managed to put the country back on track again. He also made the 1975 interim agreement with Egypt, with the US, not just mediation, but also participation, and just laid the ground for the peace in the late 1970s. So in these respects, it was a good tenure. But politically, he didn't do so well. He was not really ready for the job. When we sometimes forget that politics is a profession, that you don't switch naturally from another universe, from politics, from business or from the military, directly into politics. It takes a while, and certainly not to become immediately prime minister. Also, in terms of his personality, Rabin was not a natural politician. He was a very shy, introverted person, not always comfortable with people he didn't know. He hated small talk. He hated what you call in America pressing the flesh, everything that goes with politics. And he had a very bitter rivalry with Shimon Peres, who was his Minister of Defense. And overall, it ended with his resignation in 1977. Many people thought that was the end of his political career, but he, over the years, made a spectacular comeback.
Tell us about that relationship with Peres. The animosity and competitiveness started early and kept going, it seems, until right up until the very time the prime minister was assassinated.
That is correct. you referred earlier to Rabin and his life story being the story of Israel. I call him the quintessential Sabra, native Israeli. Born in Jerusalem, grew up in Tel Aviv, was in the youth movements, in agricultural school, in the elite unit before 48 in the IDF. Peres was, in many respects, a diaspora Jew. He came from Poland. He always had a trace of the East European accent in his Hebrew. He had not been in the military in 1948. They were poles apart in that regard. And in the 50s, there was the built-in tension between a general in the army and the director general of the Ministry of Defense, very close to Ben-Gurion. Peres wanted a European orientation. Rabin wanted a US orientation. Peres was the father of the Israeli nuclear program. Rabin in the early years had reservations about that program. So they had been rivals since the 1950s. And of course, the competition in the 70s and later on embittered the relationship. Eventually in the 90s, when I served in the government, Peres was my direct boss as foreign minister. Rabin was my boss as in charge of the relationship with the US and as in charge of the peace process. And I could see that relationship from very close by, and it was not always easy to navigate, but I could see that they were obviously disliked each other, were skeptical about one another, but they realized that they were stuck together and had to work together. And when they did work together, they were an awesome team because they had very different qualities. And when you put all these different qualities together, you had an awesome team. I always used to say, we could have the two of them in one person. Israel would have had a really, really gargantuan leader. Yeah.
But Israel had both of them, which was a good thing from Entebbe all the way to Oslo. I mean, it seems like whenever they had to get together and they realized there was something important to face, they managed to overcome their personal conflict. So they worked together very closely, I know, in the 80s when I was in the government. His defense expertise once again seemed to serve him very, very well, because in the combined government with Likud, both parties agreed that he would be defense minister throughout that period, as I understand it.
Yeah, 6 years. Yeah, this was the period that enabled him to recover from the unsuccessful first term as prime minister and to build his leadership and authority in order to become second time prime minister in the 1990s.
So in effect, he was there from 84 to 92, establishing in a much more concrete and a systematic way the military and political relationship with the United States.
Yes, he knew how to cultivate that relationship. It was mentioned that you worked with two major figures in the Republican administrations with George Shultz and Jim Baker. Rabin was very friendly with both of them, had a wonderful working relationship with both of them. It also applied to others in the higher echelons of US politics. Say, when Rabin arrived as ambassador in 1968, he arrived as the victorious general of a successful war to a country that was in the middle of Vietnam. And that gave him stature. He was a victorious general to a country that could not come to terms with an unsuccessful war. That gave him a halo that stayed with him in America. And since he saw the relationship with the United States as a country and with the Jewish community in the United States as two pillars of Israeli national security, he cultivated both. And I could see that when I was his ambassador and used to go with him to Congress, met senators and congressmen that he had known for years. I could see that years later that these relationships were still valid.
It was more than even a personal relationship, as I saw it. Was he institutionalized the military political alliance between the two countries very skillfully. The Lebanon war was not easy for Israel to deal with. The U.S. reaction to that soured over the years, and the Lavi fighter plane had to be canceled. There were things that the U.S. was pushing Israel to do, and he managed all of those things and came out of the process with a system of military support, financial support that Clinton and the Democrats embraced and continued. It was highly material, I think, for the future.
Right.
So he became essentially when he was defense minister, he did have, as you say, one major failure, and that is his inability to deal with the Intifada.
Yes, Intifada was very difficult to deal with because it was a spontaneous popular uprising, and you had to deal with not so much with armed soldiers or terrorists, but with civilian population, with children, youth, sometimes women. Very difficult for an army to deal with that form of violence. And it also persuaded Rabin that it was time to try to settle the Palestinian issue. I mean, Israel had a luxury for 20 years, from 1967 to 1987, 20 years of unpainful occupation. It didn't have to fray the cost of occupation. And the Intifada put a mirror in front of our face and showed us that this could not go on like that. And Rabin then came to the conclusion that he had to look for a solution. He believed originally that he could negotiate an agreement not with the PLO, but with the local leadership in the West Bank and Gaza, that he began to do as Minister of Defense and continued in the 90s as Prime Minister, until he realized that this just wouldn't work, that the local leadership in the West Bank and Gaza took in instructions from the PLO, and therefore in 1993, he came to the conclusion that he had to deal with the PLO, much as he disliked Arafat and the organization.
And that was the period, Itamar, where he said things that people still remember, or may have said things. You deal with it in the book where this quote, break their bones or something to that effect. You question whether, well, the evidence isn't clear that he did say exactly that, but it was a part of his character to be quite brutally frank at times about what he felt. He was no a diplomat in that sense. Yet, I mean, what emerges is that the man had so much integrity that it didn't hurt him as much as it would hurt a normal person. And I would love to have your insights about that. We had one, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So first, he didn't say break their bones. This is not true, but he did crush the Intifada because he believed that if the IDF found itself in conflict, it had to come out victorious out of that conflict. So he definitely instructed the IDF to win that contest. I should open brackets here. There was a bit of a scandal in the States recently when AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, was invited by American Friends of Peace Now to a panel commemorating Rabin, and she was criticized by some BDS people for participating in a commemoration of the men who crushed the Intifada, and she canceled. I think she made a huge mistake. In any event, second, the bluntness. Rabin was a very blunt man, positive and negative. Let's say positive, you always heard the truth from him, whether it was pleasant to hear or not. And one of the things that endeared him to the American leadership, to presidents, and so forth, was the fact that they knew that he would always tell them things as they were, and a yes was a yes, and a no was a no. They appreciated it. Thirdly, Rabin was not particularly eloquent, but he had a way of coining very powerful phrases that stuck with people. I will not quote them because most of them had to do with other individuals, but he had a way of coining a phrase that stuck with a rival for many years. So that was a sort of an eloquence. Altogether, in his second term, he became much more eloquent. He became actually delivered several major speeches. I remember Henry Kissinger once said, who would have thought that of all people, Yitzhak would become an orator of biblical proportions? Because he remembered the non-eloquent Rabin of the late 60s, and by the 90s, Rabin became so much more eloquent.
The experience I had that echoes what you said, and indeed very mightily, was where Israel had some hostages that were taken and held by the Shiites, and Israel grabbed a sheikh, and this was during the Bush administration, and Rabin announced that he had the sheikh and would release the sheikh only when the other hostages were released, essentially declaring that the sheikh was a hostage. And this was a clear violation of the hostage-taking convention, of which Israel was a signatory. Bush loved the hostage convention. He did not want anyone to admit to a hostage violation. So I called my Israeli friends, and I was asking them simply to have Rabin change the way he was describing this situation, that the sheikh was going to be prosecuted for terrorism, and that's why he was arrested, and he would be released, if there were other political reasons to release him. And Rabin said no, he would not rephrase what he said. He was a hostage, and he would be released when the Israeli hostages were released, period.
Yeah, he was like that. Famously, he had a very difficult meeting with Jimmy Carter in March 1977. His first visit to the Carter administration, first and last visit to the Carter administration. It was a very tough conversation. Carter had a misguided idea of how to solve the whole Arab-Israeli conflict in one fell swoop, and Rabin disagreed with him. So Carter invited him into the Oval Office alone and said, "Okay, Mr. Prime Minister, now that we are alone, tell me what your real position is." And Rabin said, "I don't have two positions, real and unreal. What I told you in the larger room is my position, and it remains my position here."
Now you served
that was the man.
particularly as Israel's negotiator in the Syrian peace talks. Why did they fail? And was Rabin really ready to give up the Golan?
Yes, he was, but with under very specific circumstances. If Assad was willing to make the kind of peace that Sadat had made, that is to say, give Israel full recognition, normalize the relationship, and then give Israel an adequate security regime that would make up for the loss of the Golan, he gave Secretary of State Warren Christopher a deposit, hypothetically and conditionally agreeing to withdraw if his conditions were met. Since they were not met, it did not apply. It was a way of trying to square a circle because Assad was a very stubborn man. He said he was willing to make peace, but he would not specify what the peace was before we gave a commitment to withdraw from the Golan. And our position was, you don't begin a negotiation with the bottom line. We're not telling you that we will not get to the bottom line, but there's a certain way of getting there. And so we were stuck for months on end around this issue. And then Rabin found a magic formula by giving the deposit to Christopher in order to break the log jam, which, by the way, didn't work, not because of Rabin.
So one obviously we have to ask this. It's sort of a major underlying question associated with the tragic death of Yitzhak Rabin, and that is, did it matter in terms of Oslo? Obviously, it mattered in terms of Israel and humanity and the leadership he was providing. But do you tell us what you think about the impact, if any, that the assassination had on the possibility of peace ultimately between the Palestinians and Israelis?
Yeah, I think that the major impact of the assassination is domestic, the way it affected the domestic politics of Israel. It also affected the peace process because it did not destroy the peace process, it delayed the peace process. The whole dynamic that was created in the mid-1990s was stopped when Rabin was assassinated and Netanyahu was elected. But the peace process did not come to an end, it continued. You had Peres, you had Ehud Barak, you had Ehud Olmert, and even Ariel Sharon. I should maybe mention here to members of the audience who may not know that Abe was the judge in the very famous trial between Sharon and Time magazine. The Sharon of 1982 was very different from Sharon, the prime minister. He took Israel out of Gaza. Ehud Olmert. And even Netanyahu, again, not too many people know that, he continued to negotiate with Syria into 2011, to the eve of the outbreak of the civil war in Syria. So, and now, of course, we have the normalization agreement with the Emirates and Bahrain, and in a minor way with Sudan. So the peace process did not come to an end. It was affected, but not destroyed.
And do you think that Arafat would really have followed through, given that he and the Palestinians have been offered very attractive proposals by Barak and by Olmert, and rejected them?
Right. Answer is, I don't know. But it's a very important and legitimate question. I mean, in order for this question to be tested in reality, two things would have had to happen. Rabin would need to win the elections late in 96, about a year after the assassination, and a negotiation for final status would begin with Arafat. It may not have worked out. I mean, Arafat could have insisted on the most important issue for us in order to reach final settlement is for the Palestinians to accept finality. That an agreement is it. No more claims, no claim of return, no other claims, accept the status quo as final, which is not what they're willing to give. Abu Mazen, as you indicated before, he was made a very far-reaching offer by Ehud Olmert. If you open your colleague Condoleezza Rice's book, she tells us how amazed she was at how far Olmert was willing to go and how amazed she was second time when Abbas did not accept it. Arafat may have done the same in a negotiation with Rabin, had Rabin stayed alive. We don't know, but I assume that even if an agreement had not been reached, Rabin would have frozen the situation until the Palestinians would be willing to do what they have to do in order to come to a final settlement.
Yes, he was tough that way. And I think now, although we would love to have you tell us about the situation in Israel today, and we maybe get a few words in, but I'm going to turn it over to Robert because he's gotten some questions, I'm sure, from the audience, and we'll give you a chance to answer those.
Yes, thank you both. This is really interesting. We do have a couple of questions. You have friends, both Abe and Itamar, from all over, one of which I will name, and Douglas Goldman sends his regards Itamar and wishes you well.
Thank you.
And asks the following question. Of all the prime ministers whom you have known throughout your career, who did you like as a person the most? Which one did you feel was the best prime minister, the right person for the time, who was able to lead Israel along the best path for the people and the country?
Well, I did not know Ben Gurion. I was a child when a boy when he was prime minister, but obviously he was the greatest. Maybe from what I read in his biography, he's not a very likable, easy person, but definitely a great man who deserves all the credit for founding the state and winning the War of Independence. But of all the prime ministers I came to know personally, you would not be surprised to hear that Rabin was the one I appreciated and liked the most. Yeah,
that's great. We also have an anonymous attendee asking, I've seen Yitzhak Rabin's legacy characterized as the most progressive domestic agenda that Israel has had in its history. Do you agree with this assessment? Is there any Israeli leader who has the potential of moving the needle beyond Rabin?
The question is, how do you define progressive? But on issues like education, treatment of the Arab minority, investing in infrastructure and so forth, and many other issues, Rabin took the needle quite a distance. But and it can still happen. There are ups and downs in our politics. Right now, we've had a conservative prime minister for a long time, and the needle could shift in the other direction. And who knows? I mean, our prime minister may concede loss in our elections.
And I will, if people want to submit more questions, please submit them in the form of a question. That would be great. And I've got a couple. One is just your observations on the situation in Lebanon and Syria, where we know you're an expert in what you see coming in the future with the situation there, if you have any insights there. And then separately, if you have any insight, I know Bibi, as we've been talking, has reached out to the president-elect Biden here in the US. If you have any insights on where that relationship might be heading in the coming months and years.
Yeah, okay. So my outlook on Syria and Lebanon, unfortunately, is dire. I have a book coming out in February called Syrian Requiem, in which I argue that Syria, as we know it in past years, does not exist now. It has not recovered from the civil war. It's not likely to recover anytime soon. Lebanon, again, is a failed country, unfortunately. There is a power beyond the government called Hezbollah, which is the armed militia operated by the Iranians from Tehran. It makes no government can function under these terms, and what we saw in the blast in the port of Beirut was just one indication of how bad things are in Lebanon, and I see no immediate relief. With regard to Netanyahu and Trump and Biden, I empathize with his predicament. I mean, he has had a very good relationship with President Trump. Trump has done quite a few things for Israel. And he's going to remain the president until January 20. So he needs to be grateful, he needs to show his gratitude, and he also needs to be realistic. This is still the president who is quite capable of drastic action within this period. At the same time, Biden is going to be the next president. There is a long-standing relationship with him. There is a need to mend the relationship with the Democratic Party because Netanyahu did invest more in the Republican Party than in the Democrats in the last few years. So that he's got his work all cut out for him in that regard. But he's a seasoned politician, and I think, Biden will not look for a fight. The problem will not be with Biden. The problem will be with the AOCs of the Democratic Party.
Looking at Israel, Itamar, if I may intrude with a question, they have a joint government now, and the schedule is that Netanyahu is supposed to turn over the prime minister job to Benny Gantz, who's now the deputy prime minister, in October of 2021. Is that going to happen as agreed?
I doubt it. I doubt it. Gantz himself said in public that he doesn't expect this to happen. So, the whole arrangement is very strange. It would not have happened but for the corona, which, we have a triple crisis, the health crisis, the economic crisis, and a deep political crisis. 3 election campaigns could not produce a government. So in order to somehow find a way of dealing with this, they formed this very peculiar arrangement with a prime minister and an alternate prime minister and a transition, rotation, but very few people, if any, believe that the rotation will actually take place.
So this morning, there was an important development. I heard that Israel signed a letter to the Palestinian Authority saying that they were committed to the written peace agreements between the two. And the Palestinians have announced that they will resume discussions with the Israeli government. Had you heard that? Because it was just an hour or two ago.
Yeah, I think it's one of the positive results of the normalization agreement with the Emirates. The Emirates normalized relations with us in return, among other things, for commitment not to annex parts of the West Bank. We now have a new friend. We'll have additional friends in the Gulf, maybe the Saudis even at some point. And it just makes our calculus more complicated. And the Emirates were right. By becoming friendly with Israel, they create an additional constraint on Israel to deal more fairly with the Palestinians.
But it also an incentive for the Palestinians to come to grips with the issues with Israel.
Because we come back to the point of how is time working? Well, when they realize that Arab states like the Emirates and others decided that enough is enough and they want to move on with Israel, they realize that time is not on the side.
That was a very good summation. Robert, take it from here.
Well, thank you both. We've reached our hour. Really appreciate your time and that of everybody who has joined us. I would just like to say thank you and to extend an invitation on behalf of Marcy and myself to the JCC in San Francisco and the Bay Area tomorrow when you're able to make it back. We'd love to have you both in person in our wonderful Kambar Theater.
Thank you. Thank you for doing this. And thank you, Abe.
Thank you, Itamar. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everybody. Bye now.
Bye-bye.